Okay, I think we got a critical mass here, just under 200 of you. Welcome. Happy New Year, everyone. It's great to have our group back together again. We're looking forward to sharing more for today's National Act Call. I'm just going to go ahead and launch the rest of our slides here. So we've got quite the agenda for y'all today. We'll start with just some brief intros. Again, please feel free to continue to introduce your own selves on the chat here. I'm going to be introducing our special topic today to focus on something called Psychosis Reach, which some of you may have heard about 2 years ago on these National Act calls. So I'm going to be providing some updates to that intervention. And basically, it's a novel CBT-informed care model to working with families and natural supports. And I think this is a great model to be integrating within ACT. And I want to make sure you all leave with the information to not only use Psychosis Reach yourselves, but also to be able to refer your families to Psychosis Reach, which is a free program for them. Then we will reserve some time for what we call open mic, where we want to hear from you all. What are any questions or concerns or things that you want to compare notes on with the rest of your network of ACT providers? It's very nice to have over 200 people that you can ask a question that relates to the one topic of ACT. So we want to make sure we reserve some time for that. And then our next topic is on Monday, April 7th at the same time, same place. We'll be reserving a little bit of time to drill down on the surveys that many of you filled out to make sure that we're targeting the remainder of our agendas and presentation topics to your guys' needs. So stay tuned for that topic based on what you all fill out today. Again, just a quick reminder for those of you that were familiar with the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center or Network. As many of you know, SAMHSA no longer funded those projects, and so we've moved everything related to our National ACT calls just right now to the Spirit Center website at University of Washington. You'll see right there on that right-hand corner there. You'll be able to get to all of our old National ACT consultation calls, including the ones for today. And Lorna and I have big plans to merge our resources so that we can offer more of a joint website and resources based on the efforts of both our two teams. So when you click on, you may need to click on something under resources that says ACT, but then under it, the National ACT Consultation Call presentations are one of three different folders. We also have all of the folders and presentations from our ACT Psychiatric Care Provider series in there, as well as all the recordings and the ACT Team Leader series that our colleague not Lorna, Lynette, the other L name, had led in the past. So that is right there. And then for those of you who are trying to find the ACT e-primer, wanted to make sure that you go straight to the Healthy Knowledge website. And when you get in there, you'll be able to you'll have to put in the full assertive community treatment and you should be able to get it. Don't put in just ACT. It's harder to find that way. But you should still be able to get this free course and gain access to it for your teams. Before we get going, just a couple of brief things about housekeeping. As you all know, you're all muted and not appearing on video right now. We do have a chat box and the QA box available for your use, and we'll explain a little bit more related to that here in a second. We are recording this presentation, and then we'll be making that available on the website I mentioned earlier after today's presentation. So just a quick thing about how we handle these calls if you're new to us. We like to use the chat for if you have anything that you are like having technical issues with, you can send us a direct note on that. Or if, we're just asking for people to share a response to a question we have and we want to just like have everyone sharing like their thoughts on something. But if you are looking for an answer to a question, we want you to put that in the Q&A box. So make sure that you go to that place instead and don't put your questions in the chat. Often what happens is when people make comments in that chat box, then unfortunately it gets lost in the mix. And so putting it into the Q&A allows us to be able to track which questions have been asked and which ones have been answered. So please be sure to use it for that. And then when we get to the point of the open mic time after my presentation today, you can also raise your hand and ask questions during that open mic time if you don't want to put it into the Q&A box. So stay tuned for that part of our presentation, and you can click on that part. I know many of you know us, and sometimes this feels a little repetitive, but we also recognize that we often have new people joining us each time that we have this call. So we want to make sure you all know who we are. Many of you know me. I'm Maria Monroe-DeVita, and I'm at the University of Washington. I co-direct the Spirit Center in the Department of Psychiatry here, and I'm also the director of the Washington State Center of Excellence in Early Psychosis. I'm also a co-author for the TMACT Fidelity tool and lead our training and consultation in Washington State and in other parts of the US. And I'll have Lorna introduce herself next.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, my head is going all around because I'm trying to create some polls we're going to use with you all last minute. So great to be here. And yes, a lot of what just Maria said. I'm with UNC Chapel Hill with the Institute for Best Practices and have a team of 10 consultants and trainers and other support staff that are providing support to North Carolina and several other neighboring states. So good to be back with you.
Okay, and so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to myself. And so I'm going to have to just switch my slide deck here for 1 second. And I'm also going to go scroll up to the very beginning of our chat today. In there, we have a link to the slides and the handout that I'll be referencing today. So I'm going to go ahead and put those, copy and paste those back into the chat so you've got them right there. They're also on our website. And as I said earlier, we'll have a recording of today's presentation and the whole call for you a little bit later. So let me just pull up my other slides here, and then I'll get going here. Okay, is this looking good? Lorna, you'll have to tell me.
Yep, looks great.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Okay, folks, so oh, thanks for the thumbs up, you guys. I need, it's often hard because I can't see anybody, so it's nice to get a little bit of these nonverbals. I appreciate it. So today I'm going to focus on a topic, as I said earlier, that you all heard Sarah Kapelovich present on about 2 years ago, almost 2 years to the date, and that's on something called Psychosis Reach, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy informed approach to working with families and natural supports. And as I said earlier, I think it's a real unique fit for the work that we do with ACT teams. But first, I'd like to just start with recognizing and sharing my gratitude toward my colleagues at the UW Spirit Center. I mentioned Sarah Kapelovich. She co-founded Psychosis Reach with our international CBT for psychosis expert colleagues, Doug Turkington, who's in the UK, and Kate Hardy, who is at Stanford. And Akanksha Vaswani-Bai, who has also since then joined our team, and Trez Buckland, who is a parent with lived experience of having a loved one who experiences psychosis. She's one of our Psychosis Reach family ambassadors, and I'll tell you a little bit about who the family ambassadors are in a moment. And then there's our fabulous research coordinator there, Victoria Shepard. So just wanted to say that, you know, they're really the ones who developed this model and carried it forward. I'm just here to represent the work that they've done. I also just want to say that and give praise to our amazing Psychosis Reach family ambassadors. So the family ambassadors are people who have lived experience of having a loved one who experiences psychosis. They've been through the Psychosis Reach training program, and now they have launched their own individual and group-based work and support using Psychosis Reach with family members across the US. And so that's really one of the resources I want to connect you all to, because this is a resource that any of your teams, any of your family members who have loved ones on your teams can access, and it's free. So I'll give you more of those details here in a second. I'd like to ground us in the learning objectives for today. The first thing I'm hoping for you all to be able to leave here today is just to be able to describe why evidence-based family interventions for psychosis are important. Also, to be able to identify the 3 specific interventions within psychosis reach, psychosis recovery by enabling adult carers at home. That's what reach stands for in that particular program. I'm also hoping that you can kind of take what you learn from today and apply at least one of the skills in psychosis reach in your work with ACT participants. So when I say ACT participants, I mean their family members or natural supports who know them in their communities. And then the last learning objective is to, again, kind of apply or demonstrate what you learned today by helping ACT families and natural supports and also yourselves gain access to the full Psychosis Reach curriculum. We do provide this training to other providers as well. So for example, our PAC teams in Washington State, we've been able to launch our Psychosis Reach training so that they can kind of become equipped with the same skills so that they can work directly with family members themselves, as well as referring them out to the Psychosis Reach training. So a little bit of grounding here in one of the, I think, our core strategic objectives of the University of Washington Spirit Center. One of our biggest aims is to ensure that all individuals that are navigating psychosis receive high quality psychoeducation and CBT for psychosis. And that's anybody. So it's individuals directly impacted by psychosis, that's their family members, that's, individuals with their natural supports who are, supporting their loved ones with psychosis. And whoops, I went one too far. You all are in a unique position to provide both. So the fact that you work with both the individuals that you serve in the programs, as well as you work with families and natural supports of those individuals. And just as by way of just getting us all on the same page, literally here. ACT is essentially defined by the extent to which we integrate other evidence-based practices or other best practices. And as you all know, more than anyone, our multidisciplinary teams make that possible. So because you all offer a mix of treatment, rehabilitation, support, as well as outreach engagement. Within those, you've got evidence-based psychotherapy that you can be delivering individually, as well as family education and support. And again, Psychosis Reach blends both of those together. And to further reinforce the importance of connecting with and helping ACT families and other natural supports, there are also 2 fidelity items as measured within the tool for measurement of ACT or TMACT fidelity scale. The first one is called frequency of contact with natural supports. So in this, we look at, the extent to which an ACT team connects with clients' natural supports, and we define who those natural supports are. They're typically people who are not paid service providers, but more family, friends, landlords, employers. And then the way that we measure that, or the standard by which you can get the highest score, which is a 5, is to look at, for at least 90% of clients, the natural support system is contacted by the team at least once a month. So that's the goal, is kind of that 90%. In addition to that, we also examine the engagement and psychoeducation with natural supports. So not just contacts per se, or the extent to which we're accessing or reaching out to those folks, but really looking at how. So the fidelity standard for that is that we're looking at 3 different types of services that you're fully providing to families and natural supports of the people served by your team. So the first thing is providing that education about their loved one's illness, teaching problem-solving strategies for difficulties called by the illness, and providing and or connecting natural supports with social and support groups. So that right there, 1, 2, and 3, pretty much Psychosis Reach would meet all 3 of those criteria. So just to kind of ground this again with kind of an easy way to sort of access and ensure that you've got everything covered and that you're able to really best support the people that you're serving, and including their families and natural supports. Now, I realize I just want to kind of also acknowledge, like, I think one of the biggest things that we hear from ACT is that often the families of people that you serve are often not involved And there may be really good reasons for that, in fact, that the person is not necessarily working with their family. And so that's why we include this notion of natural support. So who else in that person's life can help to support them? As we all know, we didn't get to where we are in our own lives just by ourselves, right? It's taken kind of working with and being supported by lots of people in our homes and communities. And so it's really the work of the ACT team to be able to then explore, okay, who else in your life can, help you in this way? And again, that's where Psychosis Reach can be helpful once you kind of acknowledge and access who those people are in that person's life. So just a couple of grounding ideas. And well, actually, I'm going to just quickly go back to. So I'm going to just first kind of talk about why these interventions are important to just build a case here. So we do know that about 80% of people with serious mental illness remain in close contact with caregivers, which may kind of defy what some of your experiences has been. So just to kind of put that out there, the range is anywhere, as low as 35% in some of these studies. So maybe some of the people that you're working with in ACT teams might be on the lower side of that, but that's still 35%. That's still a third of who you're serving in your programs. And again, a really unique opportunity to be able to help them in ways by way of supporting their loved ones and caregivers to support the clients that you serve, right? About 50% even live with their families. And we also know that about 80% rely, at least in part, on family for some financial support. And we know caregivers often provide emotional and social support as well. And this is going to be a really important thing for people's recovery, right? We know that just being social, having socialization, whether it's with family or other people in their lives, is an important aspect of community integration and their overall recovery. We also know in studies of people experiencing early psychosis that often about 94% will request some form of family involvement. And so you know, most of those cases, they're even saying you have unconditional access, and roughly a third of those, they are asking for kind of conditional access to those family members. But the bottom line is, even with young people, and again, why wouldn't we think that kind of over time, people, want the team to access and help them build these relationships in their communities? So, the fact that most people want the team to be able to kind of support their, support their loved ones to support them, I think is a really important thing to be, thinking about here. We know that there are a myriad of benefits of family involvement. These are all studies that focus on the benefits of family involvement for people who experience psychosis spectrum disorders and serious mental illness. So we know that there is often improved treatment adherence, reduction in relapse rates and hospitalizations, a whole range of other types of treatment outcomes, better work and role performance, quality of life, reduced substance use, and even reduced mortality. Many of these studies, if you look across them, even have, for those of you that are familiar with what an effect size is, basically the strength of the impact of the family involvement can even be as high as some of our psychopharmacological studies that are out there. So it's really important, and I can't say enough about how beneficial having family or natural supports involved is to improving treatment outcomes and life outcomes for a lot of the people that we work with. We also know that on the flip side of it too, a lot of these caregivers are negatively impacted by the caregiving that they provide to their loved ones who experience psychosis as well as other serious mental illness. So they often will experience overall work impairment and other types of indirect costs. They often report clinical levels of depression, burnout, emotional exhaustion, all at equivalent levels to those by paid psychiatric staff. So again, in a lot of cases, they are spending more time with their loved one than any of us are in the treatment sector. And so again, all the more reason that it's important that we're helping them. So we basically know that family interventions are best practices for psychosis. It's true in our US and many international treatment guidelines for psychosis. They prescribe that you should use family interventions. There's a few of them named here all around the world, including the American Psychiatric Association. And unfortunately, that prescription often goes unfilled. So in the US, we find that only about 2% of eligible Americans receive a family intervention for psychosis. In the UK, just also in comparison, is even worse than that. So we find that unfortunately, even despite these recommendations and guidelines, clinical guidelines, it's not happening. And again, ACT isn't a great place to be able to integrate them. So let's talk a little bit about that second learning objective, and that is to take a look at the three interventions within Psychosis Reach. And this will be brief, and then I want to get into some of the skills as well. So the three intervention elements of Psychosis Reach are that we provide recovery-oriented psychoeducation to families and natural supports. And we emphasize recovery-oriented because we know, I think we've all unfortunately seen, you could Google the term schizophrenia or serious mental illness and see lots of negative reports of what to expect, right? And there's a lot of old stuff on the internet, unfortunately, too, related to psychosis, especially, and what the trajectory is for folks and all of that stuff. So the importance is to be able to ground all of this in more of a recovery-oriented understanding of the illness. It's been kind of shocking to me to hear from even some of our PAC teams in Washington State, them hearing from families like, this is really the first time anybody sat down with me and actually explained to me what my kid has, what to expect, that, some of these things that they're experiencing are actually part of their illness. They're not trying to do something to me or make me angry or, frustrate me or whatever it is, that this is actually part of these are their symptoms. So that recovery-oriented aspect of that psychoeducation is key. The second one kind of hits at one of the challenges that caregivers and natural supports have, which is that they are often really burned out. And so teaching self-care strategies is the second piece. And then the third piece of it is that those cognitive behavioral techniques for psychosis. And I think that's really what makes Psychosis Reach different than a lot of the other programs out there that focus on families and natural supports. Many of these programs focus especially on education. So teaching families about their loved one's illness, maybe offering some support, maybe some skills specific, especially to communication or problem solving skills. But the actual ways in which we interact, they, need to be interacting or could correct or help in their interactions with their loved ones. That's not typically taught. And that's really where we bring in some of these CBT for psychosis or CBTP skills in to teach the families to be able to use themselves. We're not necessarily saying that they're junior clinicians or that we're, expecting them to be able to do CBT and formulation-based CBT for psychosis or anything like that. But what we are hoping that they can take is just little bits and pieces of it to be able to then kind of have a better relationship with their loved one and better support them in the care they're receiving. As we all know, often sometimes the families might even be part of the challenge, right? And working with some of the folks that we work with. So I think all the more reason that helping to kind of bring some skills to bear is really critical. All right, so then let's talk about how we apply some of the specific skills themselves. And so I want to go over something that we call the first skills. So first is kind of a mnemonic in that each of these letters kind of stands for the first word and related to each of these skills, but it also kind of helps us to understand the order of the strategies and how they build on one another. So the F is kind of falling back on that relationship, I, inquiring curiously, R is reviewing that information and kind of putting it together. S is the skills that they're implementing, and then T is the trying it out. And each of these kind of maps onto different parts of CBT for psychosis. So we've got like developing kind of a working alliance, with between family members, between the family member and their loved one who is seen by you all in the ACT team. Some of you may be familiar with something called Socratic questioning. That's basically what we mean when we talk about inquiring curiously. Reviewing that information is really kind of formulating the problem, which is a big part of CBT, and then putting into place the specific skills in CBT based on that formulation. And then the last piece is kind of trying it out and that skills acquisition. And as I said earlier, this is a mnemonic to be able to just remember kind of what the skills are. I think, we find that things like this, kind of using something like FIRST to help kind of families remember sort of the order of things is helpful. And also remembering that, you need to have that working alliance, for example, before you start doing any kind of therapeutic work, right? And so the same is true for our relationships. You need to build that relationship first. And so again, I think it also describes kind of the order of things. You need to do falling back on the relationship first before you go into curious questioning, for example. So let's go into these in a little bit more in depth. And there is a handout that is on our website that I shared the link to that kind of summarizes just a one pager that can be shared with families on the first skills that kind of summarizes each one. So let's talk about the F, falling back on the relationship. So, we know, as I said earlier, that a good therapeutic relationship is really key to any sort of positive outcomes in therapy. And so we're really applying the same rationale for families and natural supports. So we can't do much that's very helpful from a position of conflict, right? And so that's really at the heart of this skill. We find that families come in with kind of this paradox that they represent. So on the positive side, they have this established relationship with their loved one, right? Like they have this long history, a lifetime of some very positive experiences. Maybe, they were early on, but maybe not as much more recently, but they know their loved one better than anybody. They know their strengths, they know their interests, they know kind of their personality, what makes them tick, right? And yet, the other side of that paradox is that families already have an established relationship. So that's both good and bad. They've got that history. They get ingrained with kind of ways of interacting with one another, communication shortcuts or making assumptions about things, the ways that they argue with one another. And so that can be really challenging. And so what we're trying to do here is really reduce the temperature in the relationship. And so there's a few ways we do this. One is kind of highlighting strengths and shared interests. So there's something called a strengths finder, where basically we encourage families to identify and take stock of their loved one's strengths and any shared interests, to go back and think about, what are some of the strengths your loved one has? Do they have any unique skills or attributes, or, what are their interests? What did they like to do, or what did they like to do before they started struggling with their illness? Are there things that, maybe you both like to do together, or you used to do together? And so then that sets the stage for some shared foundational goals then. And it's easy to kind of overlook any sort of common ground, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out a way to kind of cut through some of the tension and find that common ground. And that's hard to do when you've got sort of hot topics on the table. So trying to kind of get to this place of like agreement versus disagreement. And so we try to help families to kind of look at like how do their goals and the goals of their loved ones align in any way, even the smallest nugget of alignment. So maybe the family wants them to get their own apartment, and their loved one is, wanting something completely different. So is there a place in between? Or, do both the family member and their loved one want their loved one to be happier? That's often a really common shared goal. Or do they both want to stop arguing? Or do they, want the nagging to stop, or being nagged? The nagging and being nagged, part of that, that's kind of where they can align. Like, okay, I don't want to nag you anymore either. So how do we kind of work from here, and acknowledging that to one another, building that kind of shared understanding. There's also the importance of just normalization. And so we do a lot of work with families to kind of help to normalize their loved ones' experiences. Our colleague Doug Turkington, who co-developed Psychosis Reach, talks about normalization is actually a way of, solving and preventing stigma. It's the antidote to stigma. And so by using CBT or CBT for psychosis more specifically in Psychosis Reach, we're inherently normalizing. We can talk about and encourage, our families to kind of better understand that we all experience negative thoughts. We all engage in unhelpful thinking. We all use, coping strategies and problem solving that, isn't necessarily leveraging the healthiest choices. And so being able also for them to understand how they may be experiencing some of the same things as their loved one. It's just their loved one is kind of taking it to a different level because of the fact that they have this psychotic experience, kind of that lens through which those experiences are happening. So it helps to kind of normalize that. The other way to normalize, and kind of a different type of normalization, is helping families kind of know real life examples. And so we've got kind of a list of different types of those examples and resources, whether it's kind of reading, a book or hearing or watching TED Talks, for example. Two of my favorites are listed right here, Eleanor Longden and Ellen Sachs. And Ellen Sachs's book is also fantastic, which I don't think is actually listed here, but that's a really good one. And then also just some of the educational videos and resources. Some of you may be familiar with Javier Amador, for example. I'm not sick and I don't need help, which really helps to kind of demystify this understanding of like, it's not that the person is like in denial just to be in denial, but that there's actually something called anosognosia that is part of the illness that is preventing them from acknowledging or even seeing that they have an illness. And so rather than fighting about that, how do we help to build the relationship? So there's a lot about, that's the LEAP model, by the way. There's a lot about LEAP that's kind of very similar to REACH in that way. It's about building alliance, building the relationship, and moving past that conflict in ways with the family member. And then the last thing related to falling back on the relationship is just kind of having that empathetic befriending. So we teach family members kind of how to react to their loved one, like to be able to say, okay, like this is an understandable reaction to, for example, thinking that everyone in the restaurant is staring at you. I can see that. I can see that this is a really hard experience, or I can see how that would be so frustrating, or that would be scary, or whatever the words are that their loved one uses. So, as I said again earlier, like this is kind of the foundation of it all, is to just build that relationship, to change the emotional temperature in the home or within the relationship in a more positive way. And lots of tools that relate to each of these different ways of falling back on the relationship. The second one I mentioned earlier is this curious questioning or inquiring curiously. And with that, what we're trying to do here is to ensure that, the family member is seeking to understand their loved one's perspective or their experience. And the way to do that is through this gentle and really non-judgmental way of asking questions, kind of fostering a sense of curiosity. And this is one is kind of mind-blowing to, I think, a lot of families, because they've always been told, don't ask questions. If you're going to ask questions about what they're experiencing, it can be seen as colluding rather than it's actually probably something they've never asked before. And guess what? Their loved one knows it. They know that they haven't taken the time to be able to understand what their experience has been. And that gets in the way of that relationship as well. And it can actually make the symptoms worse. So some examples of curious questioning we have, you can do this with any positive symptom of psychosis, hallucinations, or delusions, but this is just an example of some curious questioning about hallucinations. So, asking themselves, like, what is the language that their loved one uses to understand it? And we've got some examples there. So really getting at the heart of like, what is it that they're talking about that is at the heart of their symptoms? What do they hear? Where do they hear it? What does it sound like? What do they see, feel, taste, smell? And again, the family member is asking these kinds of questions of their loved one, not in a, in a, you know, point blank, like bullet by bullet, but really, again, it's this gentle questioning to really show, again, that you care and that you want to understand what their experience and perspective is. Also, how are they interpreting it? What are they thinking when they say, I get messages through texts in my brain? Gosh, what do you think that might be? And then helping them, again, gently, but what are some other alternative explanations for this experience that you're having? Those messages through the text in your brain. Is it, it could be that person that you're worried about on the bus, but are there any other thoughts as to maybe who else that could be, or other explanations as to why maybe you're experiencing that symptom or having that experience, I should say. And again, I think key to this, and I said this earlier, is that collaboration without collusion. So again, just that misunderstanding I think a lot of families have. They don't want to rock the boat. So often they either avoid talking to their loved one about their symptoms. So that's one strategy. Or they get in an argument with them about it. No, those people are not talking about you. This is crazy. What's going on? Like, this is not something that you're actually is happening. You're wrong here. But rather this idea of you can collaborate by way of asking questions, but it's not going so far as saying, oh, yes, that person is staring at you or saying these things about you. There's not a collusion part of it. So it's stopping short of that, but you can be curious, you can be interested, you can show empathy, you can, all of this kind of builds back to the first skill, which is once you start to understand what the symptoms are, then you can also help to build that relationship more because it helps you to kind of build more experiences together and an understanding of one another in a more positive direction because you have more information, right? That's what these family members have. So again, I'm kind of walking you through these skills as skills that you could potentially use with the family members yourselves. And you can also, and I'll share the last piece here, which is kind of getting them signed up for Psychosis Reach, which is a free training that they can kind of go through and learn these skills even in more depth. And you all can also enroll in the Psychosis Reach training yourself. That third skill is the R skill, review the information and put it together. So this is kind of what happens in CBTP, right? Now that we have some information, we've gathered more data to better understand the symptoms and the person's experience. We better understand and orient to the role. Like, what does stress do to it? Is there anything that makes any of those symptoms that we talked about earlier, or your experiences that we discussed earlier, better or worse? Better understanding kind of what makes things different or change, and how stress and stress management can help that. Also, kind of making sense of that experience through that shared understanding I mentioned earlier, and then going through basically, again, at the heart of CBTP, that cognitive triangle and even maintenance formulation. And so we'll actually help orient families to the basics of CBT. So we understand that often what we think about things and what their loved one is thinking about things, but we often will kind of guide them through their own experience. Are there things that you think that then, how did that make you feel? And how did it change your behavior? And we know these are bidirectional, right? So being able to then understand that through the lens of the cognitive triangle, applying it to themselves, and then going back to what do they know about their loved one and being able to understand kind of what their loved one's experience is. And this is where we get at, okay, I think I'm going to start to be able to understand what the skills are that we need to bring online. There's also something called maintenance formulation, and this is, I would say, something that our families do later. So I think I'm a bigger fan of starting here, starting simple, and just making it going through some examples with the family member, regarding their loved one about what kind of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and how the interplay between them. But over time, those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can also be put into what we call a maintenance formulation, kind of what keeps it going. And so we add in this notion of beliefs as well. And so in here, you could, this is an example, kind of hearing a threatening voice is the event, and then the person's interpretation verbatim, the people across the hall are talking about me, and the interplay between that interpretation, the emotions it creates, potentially creates certain behaviors, could be that they think it, they feel it, and it goes straight to the behaviors, and that there's kind of an overarching belief that happens that is larger than that, that maintains it, and that is that I'm not safe. And so helping family members really understand this is like one of the most empathy building example I can give, or skill, I should say, that I can give for families, where there's a lot of aha moments for them to better understand like what is happening within their loved one's experience, and to be able to approach it in a much more gentle and humane way. Then the next one, as I said earlier, that really sets the stage for the skills. And that's when we get into the heart of CBT and CBTP. So using cognitive and behavioral skills as well as good old-fashioned problem solving. And so we've got some examples here, and I'm not going to get into them in great detail because I want to make sure that we have time today to get to our open mic. But some of those behavioral strategies, such as, we often know, like if people put in earplugs, that can sometimes help to block out some of what they're hearing in their heads. Or coping cards, generating, balanced thoughts or coping statements that help them to kind of have handy and be able to look at and help them during these challenging times, for example, with those hallucinations. And again, I'm going through hallucinations right now. There's lots of different other kinds of examples within Psychosis Reach that are related to other kinds of hallucinations as well as delusions. Also using something called reality testing. So they test this belief that they've now come up with. So let's say the belief is that their friend is angry at them. And so, gosh, maybe do you want to go try and talk to your friend or ask your friend if they're mad at you? So just doing some of these kind of behavioral tests to get at the heart of it. Behavioral activation is another one. So lots of different strategies. These are just a few examples right here. Cognitive strategies then, and there are a number of these that are, much more than what I could do. This is like a whole training unto itself, but we try to help family members get a sense of like, are there certain things that they can coach their loved one to do that have to do with engaging more of these cognitive coping strategies. So maybe they do something called voice time, where they basically talk to their voices and say, I want you to go away. Sometimes this actually works, where you can actually set a timer and you can at least postpone listening to the voices. The voices might be there, but you're doing other things for X number of minutes or hours to not engage the voices. A thought diary, recording the exact content of a voice, and then help to kind of challenge some of the thoughts related to that. And there's also things like thinking positive thoughts about yourself when the voices are around. So there's reframing, um, sometimes even going into the nature of the voices, like assuming that the voices may be trying to help. For example, sometimes hostile voices may be helping to get in touch with difficult feelings. And so, this is again way down the road. I think there's a lot of some of these basic strategies that I think we start out for families to start to use before they get into some of these more complex cognitive strategies. And then the last skill, as I mentioned earlier, is just that good old-fashioned problem solving. I mean, anybody who has, there's multifamily support groups. This is kind of the heart of those. If you're familiar with Bill McFarland's multi-family problem solving, they basically go through this every group. So they have a family kind of take turns and define the problem, kind of get kind of drill down and understanding that problem. There's a bit of like a behavioral analysis with that, and then coming up with different solutions. So there's no wrong answer. There's lots of different solutions that you brainstorm, then compare those solutions, and then pick the best one and put it into action, and then report back the next week. So I gave that in the example of some of the groups that you might be familiar with, but in the case of Psychosis Reach, often this is just one-on-one with the families. But you could do a multifamily problem solving um, group as part of this. And then the last one is T, and T stands for trying out the skill and getting that feedback. So again, this is where the rubber meets the road, where you're just getting out there and practicing. So it's, getting a sense of using those skills and practicing them independently and generalizing them, and then providing feedback on how it worked. So that's the T. All right, so the last piece I want to cover, and this will be pretty brief here, is just to help you guys know how to gain access to the Psychosis Reach curriculum, not only for the people that you work with, the family members, I should say, and the natural supports of the people that you work with on your team, but also for yourselves. We have a certain number of slots that are for mental health providers, and so they can also attend this Psychosis Reach training. And so what it is we kind of think of it as this kind of three-legged stool. So the first thing is you would get access to a self-paced e-course. So if for those of you that might be familiar with the the ACT e-primer, for example. It's kind of like that, although there's more interactivity within it, I would say. So getting familiar with Psychosis Reach, some of it would be kind of going through what I just described in terms of like the first skills and that kind of thing. Um, but then the second piece then is a live workshop, and that's on Zoom. And that's really where they get into the skills. There's lots of skills demonstration. And what's cool about it is that there's often in those, so this is when families, clinicians, they all join on the same day. You can register for this live workshop. And there's a clinician, there's also a family peer, and a moderator of it that's kind of monitoring the Zoom chat. And so there's lots of different ways to better understand kind of how those skills come alive. And then the last piece is that they can then engage in coaching calls. And so this is typically something that is only offered to the families because this is where they get their family to family support. And the person who facilitates is one of our Psychosis Reach family ambassadors. So these again are people with lived experience with psychosis themselves who have been through the curriculum themselves and have been trained to help other families. So we've got the e-learning, which is clinician-led. We've got the live skills workshop, which is clinician and family peer co-led. And then we've got the family peer-led part, which is the family peer coaching call. And then there's also a community board that you or the family members who do the psychosis work Reach workshop, they get unlimited access to a community board. So they can ask questions of other families. So it's not just the um, live pieces that they do. It could also be afterwards where they're just posting questions on how to deal. So those of you who might be familiar with the National ACT listserv, it's kind of similar to that, but it's in this like learning management system or LMS where they post their questions in there and get connected to other families. And that's family to family. So to sign up, you can go to the Psychosis Reach website and you can, again, copy this down and send it to your families. They can enlist. I mentioned the family ambassadors. This is a little bit out of order. But also, I think just for you all, like I said, you all can also seek out the Psychosis Reach curriculum and get trained up in it. There's, again, a limited number of spots. We offer the trainings 4 times a year. Here's how you gain access again, or if you wanted to reach out to Sarah Kapelovich, my colleague, or others at the UW Spirit Center related to this, feel free to do that too. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions if there are any.
We do have a couple.
Okay.
It's all awesome, by the way. I want to go take the training now.
You can, Lorna.
I know, fit into my
Time.
spare time.
Yeah, in all
Um,
your spare time, exactly.
one recent question, just wanted to better understand when you mentioned sub-vocalization,
Yeah.
what that was.
Yes. Sub-vocalization is, let me just pull up my slide here on that because I want everyone to it's probably good for everyone to see it so you know what we're talking about. Can you guys, is this the
Mhm.
right? Okay. So I think that was back in the, um, let's see, the
There
behavioral
it is.
strategies. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So basically, this is a skill that we teach folks who are experiencing, especially auditory hallucinations, where they can do tasks in their head that you might otherwise vocalize. And so we call it sub-vocalization. And the idea here is that you're activating Broca's area that is responsible for receptive language, and you're actually stopping. That's another strategy to stop the voices from your experience of the voices because the two of those things cannot happen at the same time. And so you might count, just count to 100, and that can stop the voices, or singing, anything like that. So that's what the subvocalization is. And again, I went through that very fast. So, but for each of these, there's, worksheets and resources because it's a lot. Like, I mean, I think that's the other challenge is that we don't want to overwhelm families either. And so families can kind of take bits and pieces of it. Just again, I think the biggest thing is that we're trying to just like build a relationship and help them to better understand where their loved one's coming from. And also just help them to have some skills on board because they're, often spending the more time with them than anybody is, including, especially us, more time than many of us are spending. So,
This was way earlier. Was asked, how do you navigate situations where the individual has a legal guardian who would consent to coordinating with the treatment team, with having the treatment team be in contact with family, but the individual themselves is opposed to that coordination? This question came up before you
yeah,
hit that slide that talked about conditional connection, which made me think about that. Is sometimes the
yeah,
way to get the connection is
yeah,
give them control over what we're going to talk about.
exactly. Yeah, I think it's a great way of thinking about it. And I think even a step further to that is that there is no harm in giving families resources. So you could literally give a family member this website and they could sign up for Psychosis Reach, and you're not sharing anything about their loved one's personal health information. And so you don't need an LOI to get skills in families' hands. So I think that would be,
Good reminder.
yeah. But I agree with you, like, it's even better if you're kind of at least foot in the door around some of the conditional connection with family and, you're allowed to talk about this, but not that kind of thing. I have to say, I'm excited. I see one of our family ambassadors' names in the chat, Marianne Osborne, if you don't mind me calling you out there. So
I
it's
saw
really
that.
exciting.
And I see that our friend Betty Stewart had
Oh,
said,
yeah.
taken the course as a family member and found it helpful.
Good. That's great.
We have additional questions, but now we're going a little off topic. So
Yeah.
anybody else have questions related to this particular curriculum? I thought it was excellent. And I
Oh,
think,
good.
as you mentioned, this is more to pique people's interest to go pursue more information, which
Exactly.
you can tell
Yeah,
it's what you're doing.
there's a lot, but my hope was at the very least you could kind of get familiar with first. And like I said, you can take the course; it's free. Again, it's most of the spots are for family members, but there's a small percentage that are for providers. And I would suggest, we know that in most ACT teams, we don't tend to have a family specialist on the team, who's like, they're like the employment specialist or the peer specialist. And so who on the team is the best person to just kind of go and represent and better understand this and bring it back to your team and do some cross training in it, for example. So that's what I would recommend. So someone who's interested in working with families, I think everybody on the team obviously is ideally working with families, but someone who's kind of leading the charge.
Mm-hmm. One last comment came up, was that Katie mentioned that back when you were sharing information and said that 2% of eligible Americans receive family interventions, and apparently UK is even worse than us. Why do you think that is? Or how can we change that, was another way of framing it.
I think part of it may be that I think there's a lot of different reasons. I think one of them, I mean, especially if we think about ACT in particular, like let's just talk about ACT for a second. I do think one of the biggest things that I hear, and I know you hear this too, Lorna, and I'm sure many people on this call would say, is just that you often hear like they don't have family, or they don't have somebody in their lives that we would even connect to. And again, what I would say is like start from the place of like, okay, if not, then how do we build that connection to their community in some way and then work with whoever that person or those people are. I just think there's a lot of assumptions about the people who engage in ACT as, are receiving ACT services. So I think that can be part of it. I also just think there's not a lot of focus on it. I don't think in schools there's a lot of emphasis in it. You may go through and get your master's and a clinical degree and still, I mean, I certainly didn't get training and I got training in family therapy, but it certainly wasn't about family therapy focused on people with serious mental illness and their families. And there just it hasn't been packaged in a way and I think brought into the curricula of most of us who have gone to, you know, grad school or even just, working in the system. So I think those are two at least big contributors.
Um, I saw Betty's reaction of disagreeing that ACT families are not interested.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and
Agree. I agree with you. Yeah. But I think that's just what we hear, or that people feel like they need to work with the individual first and help them first before working with families. And I would say often it can be the opposite, where the working with family could potentially, and again, I say family broadly, it may not be family, it may be natural supports that actually help to build that connection to the person, maybe the foot in the
mm-hmm.
door. So yeah, I'm with you, Betty.
Yeah, and as we talk about, and this pertains to another person raised the question. Well, first, Michelle asked, are any teams implementing evidence-based practice family psychoed? So the proper McFarland, which Betty has a long history with too. So that's one question out there. Then another person had asked about, from a TMACT perspective, are ACT teams responsible for providing these interventions to families, or just to be able to connect them to those appropriate resources? Um, I was going to say that connected to those was one thing that we often train on and we look for through TMACT lens is, we know that you're in contact with family and natural supports in a reactive, responsive way,
Right.
trying to locate somebody, trying to check on whether a refill came through. I think what we're trying to encourage, which this certainly would do that, as well as family psychoed or other informal strategies, is seeing that working with the family is a important priority for the team in service of helping the person. So it's about that
Exactly.
proactive interventions, planned interventions. So, if we hear examples where you are trying to intervene in a proactive way through psychoeducation, through problem solving, through teaching some of these tricks of ways of, like, interfering with potential hallucinations in the moment, like from a TMAC perspective, that gets tons of credit. We see that you
Mm-hmm.
have taken that on, and we
Mm-hmm.
recognize that you're also going to rely on NAMI and other local resources to also be a
Exactly.
resource. So those are
Yeah.
all good things.
Yep.
Do you hear much about family psychoed properly being implemented through ACT of late, or anybody in the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious what the audience thinks. Is anybody kind of implementing some of those groups? I know I've seen some places do it. I think the challenge has been, um, what I've heard, I should say, the challenge has been is like more the critical mass and like have like not keeping it as a regular thing, but having like periods of time where they offer it. And then they
Mm-hmm.
might get more people admitted to the program with new families and natural supports, and then they can start a new group with those people, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it looks like we're getting a few responses there.
Yeah, we have a few that came back and said that they are. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I think, some of that problem solving, like it's one of the many skills within psychosis reach, and you could, yeah, I think reach is one way of doing this, right? And then I think the multifamily groups give you a sense of community, give you a sense of problem solving and being able to brainstorm together, and potentially a natural support group, outside of the group. And I like that you tied it back to Lorna. It's like, yes, it's about the families, but it's also very much because I think ACT teams sort of see it as their job. They're mainly in support of the person that's right in front of them, who they're supporting. It is in the service of supporting that person by supporting their
right.
families. Like I just, I think it goes both ways. And I also think that's the key to graduation. At least one of the important keys is that integration and support in the community outside of the ACT team.
All
Oh,
right.
interesting. Family Psycho Ed is no longer a toolkit within SAMHSA. I know there is that one of the ones that they're going to look at?
Well, it felt like it just disappeared. And when
Okay.
I was recently talking to SAMHSA, I asked about this and they kind of acknowledged it, but weren't quite sure the source of where it got taken down. So we noticed it months ago, I think, that it was gone.
But the Bill McFarland's, multifamily groups, that is a book and still available.
Right. Yeah, so people are bringing up like the first episode teams, tend
Yeah.
to be skilled in this because this is a big part. So it's a great way to draw some of the knowledge and resources if your agency does have
Yeah.
FEP programs.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the On Track New York manuals, the family manual actually uses Bill McFarland's group. They offer it in both group or individual. Um, and the Navigate first, first episode psychosis manual is more individual only, and there's problem solving built into it, but it's not like a problem solving group like the Bill McFarland one. But I could put both of those in the chat too, because I do think they're really, I mean, we've had people work between both programs, or been a like one of our Navigate teams team lead, and then come over to ACT and be like, this is great to work with families. So just the language is more focused on first episode.
Hmm. If anyone here, I saw Katie raising, she would love to hear from any team who was able to change their approach to how they're working and connecting with families. And I was also going to drop in, as I've been trying to do here and there. Um, oh, it's not in there. I was going to find Betty's talk she gave for us, which was excellent too here, but it's not in our list.
We can send it around to folks. I know we're still probably pulling some of the old ones onto the
Okay,
website.
maybe it's not
Yeah.
listed yet. All right. Well, as you're grabbing those, we had a few off topics, so that may be a good segue. And we want to make sure we get our polls in as well. I was looking on our side if we pulled it over yet. Oh, I have it. We pulled all of them on ours too. Sorry, Betty, you put yourself out there, so we're going to put your old video up here for everyone. Good. All right. All right, back to some of my questions. Um, so Kenneth had asked, what key performance indicators are used to measure the effectiveness of the ACT program? How is data collected and analyzed to inform program improvement? So that is a big question, Kenneth. So you have fidelity reviews as an option to be able to go in and more systematically look at how the team is performing on a measure. The DAX is one measure. The TMACT, which we are co-authors of, is one measure. Also, you can look for meaningful indicators of performance and track it more often. The problem with fidelity reviews is that they don't happen that often. So they are a nice comprehensive review, ideally coming from a perspective outside of the agency and team. But what you're missing is that week to week, month to month tracking of how is the team doing to kind of give feedback. So, and being able to look at change over time. So this is where you're looking at both performance. And for me, performance would be indicators that the team is truly operating using a team approach, that the level of care provided makes sense for an ACT team in terms of frequency of contacts. What is their coordination with other healthcare providers? That's one thing that we looked at in the national study that we've talked about many times over. But outcomes we find are not collected that often. And the sad thing is when they are collected, there's no feedback loop to you all about how you're doing in comparison to other teams in similar areas or situations. So I think that those are some of the things that I think I'd be considering is what are the meaningful things that would reflect good practice for your team. And also, as we all know, and somebody else brought up here around workforce, indicators of health of an ACT team is also just the overall how supported the team is altogether. Do they feel like they're in a good space in terms of cohesion and getting the right level of support? So I think it's important to look at performance, have some select outcomes that are meaningful to track and look at, but also how is the team feeling and doing too? Welcome other people's thoughts. Oh, it
Looks
didn't work
like,
for you?
yeah, it also looks like they're saying that on track manual people couldn't open, or at least one person said it had changed or wasn't available. Let's see if somebody got the YouTube to work. I'm gonna just paste this in. I don't know, Lorna, I'd be curious how many of folks are from New York, but I know we've talked a bit about the New York Office of Mental Health website and just recognizing that it's probably one of at least the best examples of sharing data, of outcome data across ACT teams across the state. And so the kinds of things they look at there, just at a glance, and I'll put a link to it here in a second, but like education, employment, whether the person who's experiencing homelessness, hospitalizations, um, substance use disorder. They also track assisted outpatient treatment, I think because New York State has used a lot of assisted outpatient treatment, so that might be to some extent dependent on what you've got in your state. And then forensic involvement, which I assume is like arrests or incarcerations, those kinds of data. Um, so just some examples of that, and I'll put this in the chat.
Yeah, for those who haven't visited New York's website, you can geek out on that data for a long time. The only drawback, no offense to my New York folks, because kudos to even put that together and have nice Tableau displays, is I don't believe that they have a system in place to verify submissions. So I think that you have to appreciate that there may be some error there in terms of the submissions of the data. Because I think they have to fill out a CARES survey every 6 months for everybody that's being served.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we just know that when teams get put on to routinely collect and report data, sometimes the reporting kind of starts falling apart a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Somebody had mentioned, I think that this could be coming up in the poll potentially or not. I can't remember if we listed it. Can you share any resources on really good safety trainings for community-based providers? This is a topic that actually was raised recently within our email listserv that we have, which some of you are on, but some may not be on. And a few resources and ideas I think were shared across from a couple of teams, but this remains a pretty important topic that we've discussed, like wanting to keep thinking about ways to try to bring in good resources and speakers to kind of be helpful for this. So if anybody in the group has good resources off the top of their head around safety trainings, please share them. We've done some things in the past, which again, these videos live on my website and also for the Institute for Best Practices. And I think Maria has been bringing over a lot too. I'll just drop the link to our page where you can skim. But Dr. Sarah Demary had did a two-part series a few years ago on risk assessment using the START, which we think is pretty cool.
Yeah. That was a great talk. Lots of resources. And I think we did have a question about the New York or who was using, what does New York use? So I just put what I had also put in the chat, I put in the Q&A too. So, okay, Crisis Prevention Institute does a very hands-on training for safety. That's good to know. That may relate to our questions too, Lorna, about future trainings,
Okay.
drilling down a little bit more.
All
Right.
right. Well, we are basically in open mic time on our own. So you can use this to kind of bring questions up. We do want to someone's second CPI. I feel like I need to think about what people had used it here and then felt like it was a little limited in some things, but I'm trying to remember the details.
Yeah, so there's two, CPI and then PROACT.
Yeah, I'm looking at ProAct right now to just have it pulled up to look over.
Yeah.
Um, but as we keep monitoring for questions, I can take and get the polls going.
Yeah, anything folks came to this call that they were just dying to ask other ACT teams or other states about related to ACT? And there's a lot going on right now at the federal level, which may be affecting you locally. So just anything at all that just would be helpful for folks to compare notes on or resources. And as we're waiting, what Lorna is going to pull up is so some of you may remember we're going to do this after every call, have a survey and asking some more targeted questions about how we can continue to develop this national call that we've kind of continued to still do even after the funding ran out. But you all had a lot of really good areas that you want future topics on, but some of them are like really large areas. So like, for example, I think the most popular one was you all want more training or presentations on specific interventions within ACT. And so that's great. But we want to dive down a little bit deeper with you all today to say, and which ones would those be? Like we've had a bunch kind of come through over the last now 3 years, I think, since we've been doing these calls. We could always circle back to some of those, but it just would be good to kind of, drill down a little bit deeper. So that's what we'll do with the polling part of it. Also, I have another question in the chat in the Q&A at least for our open mic time. So the question is, Katie Kirk is asking from Maryland. So for states that have AOT laws, and that's assisted outpatient treatment, are all your ACT teams required to serve a certain number of AOT clients or save a certain number of spots for AOT? Maryland is rolling out AOT for the first time. Just curious. And so I think people could put their responses in the chat. I think is a good place for us to just collect those because I don't think you can all answer her in the Q&A. I could say in Washington, where we have AOT, but it's just getting launched, we do not have a certain number of spots for AOT. Michigan, they don't save spots. Whereas, is this Louisiana or Los Angeles? I assume it's Louisiana. LA. Los Angeles. Okay. That's
Oh,
good to
sorry.
know. So
Um,
slot based.
it's rare that I hear that it's slot based, myself. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. In the original Kendra study, because New York wasn't slot based either, because we looked at whether involuntary committed folks essentially crowded out those who wanted to be voluntary and did not find that it did. And with that said, I think part of AOT for me that gets lost in our discussion about AOT is that AOT is so much more than preserving room or knowing that you're going to serve people or on a commitment. The big thing about AOT is that you have a close coordinating effort with a program that is overseeing both what the judge had said in terms of the order, but also what the team agreed to provide. So basically, a really strong AOT program, you have an entity outside of the providers who basically is holding the person under the commitment accountable for following through on the terms of the commitment order, but also it's supposed to hold the provider accountable to following through on the things that they said they were supposed to help with, like help get a job, for instance. That's the sad thing is I think it falls apart in a lot of places. And all we're talking about is just involuntary outpatient commitment. So, which most ACT teams who are operating in states end up serving people who are on an involuntary, it's nothing new about this. Somebody was asking, I'd like to learn about what the progression of psychosis is over time. What does it look like at the later stages of schizophrenia?
You are probably seeing it in your team, I would imagine, because of just who you're serving within ACT. I mean, I think it skews, I think, the perspective, right? I was talking about like bringing in more of a recovery perspective with families and natural supports, and you're kind of building hope there. But I think one of the challenges for a lot of people who experience schizophrenia spectrum disorders and get referred to ACT and are served by ACT teams, these are folks who have been through a lot before they got to ACT. And so I think what you're seeing is a lot of folks who, especially those who experience psychosis, those later stages of psychosis and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So they may have been on and off lots of different antipsychotic medications, which we know can make it harder for those medications to be effective over time. And so, we see a lot of untreated symptoms even when they're using those medications or on those medications, even taking them. But I think again, that's one of the struggles. I think for a lot of the folks who are referred to ACT is not taking medications necessarily or not in a consistent way. Um, and then I think some of the just outside of symptoms, I think what you will tend to see is a lot of the other elements that we see in ACT, which is just some of, especially the functioning of a lot of the folks that you're serving goes hand in hand with the illness, where they may have challenges with taking care of themselves or socialization or, lots of different types of role functioning in their communities. So that's I know there's a lot to that question, but hopefully that kind of just helps at least kind of, I think what to answer your question, you really do probably see it right in front of you within your work with serving folks in ACT.
And I've always been fascinated by this idea of geriatric ACT teams.
Yeah.
Like what it is that they're bringing that's new, because I'm always like, is it these folks that we're encountering within the system for the very first time that they need ACT
Mm-hmm.
level of care later in life versus what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying is
Yeah.
people are aging into it because they
Yeah.
joined your team 10 years ago.
Right.
Um, so Alicia had brought up maybe a training on dealing with AOT and your reporting responsibilities versus ethics as a social worker or a therapist. How does the ACT team maintain independence in an AOT landscape? That's a great topic to put forward. I think something you're touching on here is, things that we talk about even just outside of AOT per se, is if somebody who's not within the team has some mandate for somebody to do urine drug screens, the team does not have to be the one trying to collect that cup of urine. You agree to help support the effort. You will give them rides to some place to get, but the more we get directly associated with being the one who is the heavy hand and the potential source of coercion, that's not good for our working alliance and ability to build trust. So we want to parse those out. And I think in the same spirit is that AOT is a lever that could be pressed to basically compel somebody back into the hospital if the orders get rescinded. So we don't have to press the lever immediately because they missed their medications 2 days in a row or because we saw that they were smoking pot again. I think that's the negotiation piece, is that it's the agreement that how and when and how much we press the lever of AOT, we have to finesse that in a very person-centered way based on what we think the true risk is too. So Joseph's asking a question about treatment plans here. Your question of like, what do you do when you have the treatment plan ready, the person's not there? Who could sign it? Can staff sign treatment plans when they've tried but unable to see the patients in person? So this one's a tricky one. And we actually have, I think, person-centered planning as one of our topics on the list for you guys to pull on. But ideally, what's happening is a plan is getting created with the team and the person, or a few team members and the person. There's agreement, clarity about what we're all doing. What do you care about? What we're going to do to get there. Now, I'm all for it's going to take time to maybe, don't be on the spot to have the final document of a plan ready at the point of that conversation so everybody's signing it. So I think what sometimes happens is the good efforts of putting it together with the person's input happens, but then by the time you go to get it signed, you're having a hard time getting that signature for whatever reason. So I've seen a variety of ways in which teams have captured that, like unable to locate or something, verbal agreement, various ways I've seen teams try to capture it. What I would do is don't create the plan itself without that person part of that discussion, which I kind of am reading into this too. They need to be part of that process. And even if there's somebody who's not very verbal, use creative ways to use visuals and cards and value card sorts to help them express what it is they care about.
We have about 5 minutes left. I wonder if we should go to the polls, and then I could just ask of folks this last question and they could put the answer in the chat while we launch the polls. Does that sound okay, Lorna?
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna
So we had one question, and again, go ahead and just put your response in the chat so that everyone in the group can see it. And the question is, has anyone implemented the transdiagnostic intervention for sleep and circadian rhythm dysfunction, otherwise known as Trans-C in ACT? It was studied in SMI populations and seems like it would fit well in the model. A lot of people saying no. That's good to know. Yeah, and I think the idea here is, especially for people with bipolar disorder, the circadian rhythm work is actually really key to that. And so we've talked a lot about psychosis because it's so much of who we see in ACT, but I think that is, I'm gonna look into it now that you've asked this question to see what we know about it. Thanks for asking the question. It looks like it's not been used, but sounds like there's some interest. So, okay.
Okay, here's the first poll. I think I'm about to share my screen. So the directions, you can use your phone or you can go on your website browser to polev.com/Lorna M. That connects you. If they ask you like sign in, there's a way you skip it and just say I'm a guest, and you don't even have to put your name in, nothing. Just get to the poll. You can use your camera to scan the QR code. The question first is, we'd like to hear your preferences for April's topic, and future topics too. We have these grouped a little bit. Because in the evaluation last time, people were mentioning crisis response services, but being a little bit broad at times with what they're talking about. We tried to drill this down to more specific categories related to crisis response for an ACT team. So we're asking you to rank order these. So all of them are a ranking slide where you can put your first preference, second preference, and so forth. And so far, there's no responses. So I want to make sure maybe y'all are getting a moment to join.
I put it in the chat too.
Oh, good.
So, and so you put it your phone, right? Primarily, or launch your computer if you.
You can pull up, you can leave us and go to another tab on your computer and just put that email address in, or you could
Oh,
use
here
your
we go.
phone.
Starting to get some responses now.
Okay, good. Here. So there's a lot of you here. So you got to be quick to the draw here. This will be moving for us for a little bit.
Yeah, and again, we just don't want to we want something useful, and because of how each of these is its own training, really, we want to make sure that we're giving you something that you can is digestible in a very short time that we have for these calls. So something that could really be useful to you all.
Let's see the number.
Yeah, and you can bypass when it asks you to register, actually, and still fill it out. Thanks, Brianna. Hopefully that helps.
Um, trying to see how many responses have come in, but all right. I may have to lock this one down and then move on to the next one. Only because
Hmm.
a little frozen right now. I can see if I can back.
Oh, I wonder if because it's frozen, some people are saying that you're trying to do it, but they haven't been able to get into it. I think it's maybe they need to hold off because a bunch of people are saying they can't get to it.
We
Do you have to relaunch it?
I shouldn't. It will have everybody else's. It saves responses. I'm just. This is likely Lorna has too many things open on her computer, as you can
Oh,
see.
okay. Hopefully we can keep you on just for another minute. I think we just have one more poll, right?
No, we have two.
Oh, two. Okay.
All right. Well, let's try this one. Let's. Is this one anyone able to see?
Yes. Lots of
Good.
thumbs.
Okay. I'm going to keep closing things down. Off my end.
And again, we just want to make sure we're digging a little deeper here. So many different psychosocial interventions we could be going over here. So we want to see where the greatest interest is so that we can direct our next few calls focused on those topics.
I did see though, for those who did get their responses in, and I'll check to make sure I may be able to see them in poll everywhere, that crisis planning and then crisis response and de-escalation were the two at the top the last time we looked. All right, let's see. Oh, integrated treatment for substance use disorder. Good. I saw a couple of Case Western folks here today. You're our favorite go-tos on experts on this
Consider
topic.
yourselves notified.
Yep, that's why you're hired. CBT for psychosis. Good. Wellness management recovery, addressing daily living, community integration, support employment.
Okay.
All right. And then we'll go to the last one here, if that's all right.
And if you're still with us, I just want to, I'm going to just put a link to our evaluation, and from there you can get a certificate when you fill it out, certificate of participation. So again, we use this information to guide our ongoing calls and planning for them. Okay, these are foundational elements of ACT. No CEUs, I'm sorry to say, because CEUs unfortunately cost money that we don't have. We're, we were doing this out of our volunteer time right now. But if your state does contact hours, you could probably use the certificate for that, just so you know. I know in Washington State, for example, you can say, at least show it. It's not a CEU, but it's continuing education contact hour. Oh, I think we've got a couple people of one person who's completed it. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I'm again just trying to
Is it
see if me getting rid of things
okay?
helps. This is unusual, but
Okay. Well, we've got some good. This was the third one in the list, so maybe we can start with the interventions and then the crisis related topics because those were the top two. And we'll follow up with you all on what we've got for April. How's that sound?
that sounds good.
Okay. Thanks, you guys, for
Thank
for
you.
joining us, staying with us. 4 minutes past the hour here, and we'll see you guys soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.